let's get into this. These are your lands. There's so many things you can do out there that, and how many of you are users of public lands? BLM, Forest Service, Park, all of you should know this thing. I spent 43 years in parks, and there's some information in here that I did not know as far as it relates to the history. You all recognize the United States. You recognize the shape of the states and the shape of the country. I will agree with you that these aren't the colors of those states, but representatively, that's what it looks like today, and we all recognize those different states. It's not how it always looked. When the first Europeans got here, this place was totally inhabited with numerous native tribes that were here for a long time. And my absolute guess is they weren't sitting around the campfire at night hoping that Europeans would discover them. And the longer we were here, the more certain I'm sure they were that they wish that hadn't happened. But we did. And I'm not going to talk about this part of the history, although it is very real and many of you know about that. What I'm going to talk about is how did we get from the original 13 colonies to where we are today with that map as it looked like. And in 1776, we declared our independence from Britain. For the next 5 years, it was not at all certain that was actually going to be successful. We were not generally winning those fights. While they were talking about it, these were the original 13 colonies. One of the arguing points, and when they were trying to put together the first government, which we'll talk about in a second, which was under the Articles of Confederation, one of the sticking points of the 13 colonies was that Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and Connecticut and Massachusetts, 6 of the 13 states, claimed land all the way to the Mississippi. The other states or colonies at that time said, that's the deal killer. Those are not your lands. If we win this fight, it's not going to be okay that you keep that land mass when the rest of us won't have it. So they argued for about 5 years during the fight, which ebbed and flowed and went against us more times than not. Finally, they agreed that no state would exist until we agreed and signed these Articles of Confederation, which was how we were going to run this government if we were successful in winning. They finally agreed on this proposition that basically, in paraphrasing it, that these lands would have been won by the blood and treasure of all of us, so they should be all of our lands, those lands outside of what would become the original or the first 13 colonies or 13 states. Anyway, fascinating information. I never knew before I started doing this that those 6 colonies had claimed all the way to the Mississippi. That was a very contentious situation. So how did we get the rest of it? And this to me is a fascinating story. The original piece that we got, this piece here, was ceded by Great Britain in the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Signatories of that were Great Britain, the United States, and France, and Spain actually signed that agreement. So all the land to the Mississippi River was ceded to the United States from Great Britain. That became the territory of the original 13 colonies. So if those were the original 13 states, all this land would have become what? Public land, owned by all of us, won in war. In 1803, the next piece came in the land. We had a claim to the Mississippi River. France owned the Port of New Orleans. We wanted access down the Mississippi River. So Thomas Jefferson started negotiating with Napoleon Bonaparte, who has started his 4th or 5th war in Europe and was running out of money. And they were negotiating for access to the Port of New Orleans. And Napoleon said, you know, instead of just doing that, how about if we up the ante and I sell you all of France's holdings in the New World? And they did. Probably the finest real estate deal, certainly in this country's history. You know how much that cost us? $15 million for a quarter to a third of the land mass of the United States. So now we had by war, by purchase. The next thing that came on the plate was a boundary dispute with Britain over this country up here. Instead of going to war, which we'd already done in 1812, and that didn't go well for us, but it finally ended. Instead of going to war, Britain ceded this below the 49th parallel, and we ceded everything north of that to them. So by treaty, we fixed that problem and didn't go to war. In 1819, because of incursions by native tribes into these colonies from Florida, which was owned by Spain, and actually runaway slaves going down into here, we were going to go to war with Spain over this. Spain owed us $5 million, and they said, I tell you what, we will give you Florida if you cancel the debt. So Florida in the Spanish cession of 1819, East Florida, West Florida, and these two pieces, and I'm not sure why those two disjunct pieces were Spanish, but they were, and we got them. So now you've got war, purchase, and treaty twice, gave us that. I guess the next piece would be in 1836, a little place y'all have heard of, Texas, and I'm gonna go into that a little more because people ask me all the time, man, isn't it great that Texas is private and don't have to deal with all these public lands? And I said, well, Texas is a great state. If you like to hunt and fish and camp and hike and mountain bike and stuff, four-wheel drive, go down there and try it on, because it's a challenge if you're not in one of the state parks, because there's not a lot of places to do it unless you're going to lease a place. Well, we won in 1836, and as I'll talk about in a little more detail, Texas became a republic for 9 years, and I'll go into that a little bit more. So the War of 1836 gave us this piece. Over 9 years, Texas ended up claiming this whole landmass. In 1846, we went to war with Mexico. At the same time, President Polk was considering a war with Britain again over the Oregon territories. You've heard, if you study history, 5440 or fight. The 54th parallel would have been way north there. People wanted to go to war with England so that we could claim a lot more of Canada. Polk said, I'm not going to fight two wars at the same time. So they did a treaty. We ceded everything, any claims north of there, and Britain ceded this to us. And so that's how we got the Oregon territory. In 1846, we were fighting Mexico. In 1848, this war ended in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and Spain relinquished any claim to Texas and to the California territories, the Mexican territories out west. In 1853, we were trying to run a transcontinental railroad out through here. We needed some land here. We negotiated a purchase from Mexico without going to war, and we bought the Gadsden Purchase for $10 million. The next piece was probably Alaska, at least the second best real estate deal in history. We bought all of Alaska for Russia, whose only interest up there at the time was fur seals. And that was in decline, and the Tsar wanted some money. So he agreed to sell us Alaska for how much? $7.2 million, 2 cents an acre for Alaska. Think of what they feel now about that deal. But Alaska for us, in 1898, Hawaii was an independent country. It had a queen. It was a stable country. It was a peaceful country. We had a bunch of Americans down there growing fruit and that kind of thing. They decided they didn't want to have to deal with a local government, that they wanted to be part of the United States. So they said, we are under threat. Please send in the Marines, which we did, send in the Marines. And we seized that, and a few years later, we annexed it as part of the United States. We deposed the queen that was there, took Hawaii, and you know what the name of the first governor of Hawaii was? Dole. Does it ring a bell? Mr. Dole was the first governor. Then we got, in 1898, we got Puerto Rico after the Spanish-American War ceded to us. And the last, and I didn't know this, that we picked up right before the US entered World War I was the Virgin Islands from Denmark for $27 million. So that's where these lands came from, war, purchase, territory. And who owned them at this point? We all did. So how did it get distributed so that a lot of it now is owned by the public, by individuals? Property clause, remember that comment that I said, people said the Constitution doesn't say federal government can own land. This is Article 4, Section 3 of the Constitution, and you can read it yourself. It says very clearly that the United States not only can own property and territories, but the Congress has the ability to make all laws and deal with that in however it sees fit. So the United States not only can, it always has owned property. So in getting it disposed of, happened in a lot of ways. Those revolutionary soldiers, when America got its independence, it had no money, so it paid them in land. If you were a colonel in the Continental Army, you could get as much as 500 acres. If you were a private or an enlisted person, 100 acres, which was a lot of land at that time. That was worth doing. There was all kinds of other ways that people could buy money, ranging from a $1 an acre to $1.25 acre. You say, you got to be kidding me. $1.25 an acre, $1.25 in 1785 was a bunch of money. And $640 to buy a square mile of land was a huge treasure for these people. It was different. Well, under these acts, we transferred the US out of those lands we just saw, transferred nearly 180 million acres of land over the time these were in place. The Homestead Act in 1862 was another vehicle for moving lands out of the federal estate. The General Land Office that was in control of these lands at the time, their mission was to dispose of the federal estate, dispose of it. And they were pretty good at it. Homestead Act said that if you were the head of a household, and that could be a woman or a man, if you were the head of a household, you could claim 160 acres of land. That was expanded to 320 and then 640. Why would they increase the amount of acreage? The good lands got picked first. So if you had water and good soil, you could do pretty well with 160 acres. Plus, you didn't have a tractor. You had to clear that land manually with a mule or a team somehow. So it went to 640 as it became more arid. You had to be 21 years old, and you had to build a house, and you had to live on that land for 5 years before you could do anything else with it. Then it was yours. So the Homestead Act over time transferred another, on top of the 180 million acres of land, 270 million acres of land to the public in private ownership. So that's a big chunk of territory already. Then the railroads. Again, the United States had no money. So it was paying for everything it needed to happen by using land. The railroad, for example, all land on either side of the track, 200 feet on either side of the track. Those of you in state parks that used to help me with the Texas State Railroad or the rail trail system at Mineral Wells or up at Caprock, that right-of-way issue was something we dealt with a lot. Well, these right-of-ways were 200 feet on either side of the track. Then the land they got in the checkerboard was either 640 or 1,280 acres per mile of completed track that they were transferred. The 6,400 would be if it was in an existing state. The 1,280 was if it was in the territories, because it was not organized and controlled as well. There were all kinds of other challenges for that. So another 180 million acres were transferred out of the public estate to private individuals. Now you're talking 180, 180, and 270 million acres of land. That's a lot of land. Well, Texas, fun story. I didn't know this, but when Texas, and I know I got a couple of historians, Bill and Barry back there, so you correct me if I get any of this wrong. I'm thrilled to have you here. This is what we won in the Texas Revolution there initially. Texas claimed over the time of the Republic this country that resembles in part what we recognize as Texas today. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ceded all of this to the United States, or recognized Texas during that transaction. This being Texas, that being United States territory. The Rio Grande became the boundary as opposed to the Nueces River, which was the original boundary. In 1850, during the Great Compromise, the United States agreed to purchase this piece of land. This panhandle, that would be about Rawlins, Wyoming right now, that Texas claimed at one time. This was all ceded to the United States for $10 million. And what we recognize as Texas now is there. Well, some more about Texas. And I share this not just with you guys, but people are fascinated with the fact that we were a country at one time, and why, the question is, why doesn't Texas have public land? Well, this is why. Texas is right at 96% privately owned land. How did it get there? Well, pre-Republic land grants of about $26 million, a pre-Republic land grant would be what? A Spanish or a Mexican land grant. And at the time of the Revolution, those were honored. They didn't take them away from you. So if you had those already, you got to keep them. Texas established the Republic of Texas headright grants. There were 6 or 7 different categories of that. Using a level 1 head grant, for example, if you were the head of a household, again, a woman or a man, and you did not have a Spanish or Mexican land grant, you could claim, and you were in Texas at the time of the Revolution, 1836, you could claim a Republic of Texas head grant, level 1, and that would be 1 league and 1 labor of land, which is about 4,600 acres. The league, which I think is 177 acres, was farming. The labor is 177 acres, which is farmable land. The other was grazing land. So 4,600 acres. That's a big chunk of land. Texas war veterans, if you fought in the Revolutionary War, that was 3 million acres were distributed to you. The railroads, to build the Texas railroads, and we had a pretty robust bunch of railroads, 35 million acres of land were given to the railroad companies. In the Texas Constitution, when it transferred to the railroads, they could not keep it. They had to sell it. So it dumped a bunch of land on the market pretty quickly, and all that land was bought by either land speculators or individuals. By 1900, all of the unappropriated lands were set aside for the benefit of the public school system, and that would be, I guess, the GLO lands that are left today. By 1900, it was pretty well done. Big Bend is an interesting phenomenon. Most of the national parks, as we were talking about, were carved out of the federal estate, out of public land. Texas didn't have any. By the time Texas came, by the time we're talking about something like Big Bend, all that land was gone. By 1900, it was gone. So what they did is they established a park out on the Rio Grande. I think it was the Canyons of the Rio Grande or something state park. They added to that park with lands that they foreclosed on delinquent taxes and put some more in there. People started raising money. There was a local person there and a Texas Ranger that decided Texas needs a national park. They started piecemealing, adding more lands from willing ranch sellers. They got enough that they went to Congress and said, we want to establish Big Bend National Park. Congress authorized a national park, didn't establish it. They couldn't establish it because it's all privately owned land. Authorized the national park. The legislature then came in and gave money. People raised money all over the state of Texas, including school kids. And the 1 week after D-Day, Texas handed Franklin Roosevelt the keys to what became Big Bend National Park. And that's how we got Big Bend. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a national park because it was all ranch land out there. Fun story and a great place. I just came through there the other day. John Wesley Powell, I know many of you have heard of him. He's the one-armed Union major that took the first expedition and the second expedition down the Grand Canyon. If you've ever done the Grand Canyon, the thought of sailing into there in a wooden boat, I've done it, not in a wooden boat, not having a clue, not looking at a river guide that's going to tell you, or somebody that's been there before. You just come around the corner and you go, I won't say what they probably said, but it had to be scary, and they had a heck of a time. Well, John Wesley Powell is a fascinating character in and of himself. He became, by 1877, he was the director of the U.S. Geologic Survey in DC. He was a surveyor by trade. He knew the West. He'd been all over the West. And he went to the National Academy of Science meeting and made this statement, which just sent the crowd and the politicians into an uproar. What he is saying is most of the land west of the 100th meridian cannot support agriculture. This was his map, not this particular one, but this is representative. The 100th meridian runs kind of up I-35 all the way up that way. Everything west of there, all the way to the Sierra Nevadas, Cascades, is too arid to support conventional agriculture. And boy, I tell you, living out there right now on the Colorado River with Lake Powell at 23% or less full, and Lake Mead not far behind that, we are in deep trouble. What he was saying basically is, yeah, you can build reservoirs and stuff, but if you overuse those reservoirs, it's not sustainable. Well, growing cotton and alfalfa in the desert is proving not to be very viable, and it's just not recharging. I don't know where we're going to go, but we're going to have to learn a whole new way of dealing with not much water. Adding states, that same section of the Constitution that describes the fact that the U.S. can own property also articulates how the states will be admitted to the United States by Congress. The state has to apply, has to have a constitution. The citizens of the territory had to vote for it. Congress had to approve it. You could not carve your new state out of existing states unless those states agreed, which didn't really happen. So that's how they went forward. Well, how did they figure out what was what? In 1785, Thomas Jefferson established the rectangular survey system, which grids the entire United States into 36 square mile blocks, 6 miles on each side, numbered 1 through 36. The whole United States looks like that. For example, Utah gridded looks like that. Those are 36 square miles in each township there. In Utah statehood, when Utah came into the United States, it was given in its Statehood Act nearly 7.5 million acres of public land for these specific purposes when it came in. And it was given 4 sections per township blocked around. People said, well, those lands were ours, we want them back. You know what? When in 1847, Brigham Young brought his Mormon pioneers into the Salt Lake Valley, 1847. What did he bring them into? He brought them into Mexico. That was Mexican territory. That was not the United States. It wasn't until the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo a year later that became U.S. territory, and that land was United States public land because it was won in the Mexican War. So it never was. But boy, I tell you, some of the disinformation you get out there today said, we want our land back. It was ours. Well, what does the Utah Statehood Act say? Every state that came into the Union has a Statehood Act. It articulates if lands was given to them by the United States, what those lands were. Well, what does Utah Statehood Act, which is in their Constitution, say? If that's not good enough, Section 12 says this. So how do you get out of that we want our lands back? You don't. And so it's been a fascinating conversation to have out there. Utah state lands, Utah receives those sections at when they became a state, they got that much land. They've sold all but that already. So those lands are not public. Their purpose is to dispose of those lands. In the case of Nevada, Nevada got 2 sections per township. I guess Brigham Young was a better negotiator than whoever was doing it in Nevada. They got 2 sections and they've sold all but 300,000 acres of their original estate. The national park idea. Well, all these lands are out there. People are starting to move west. The trappers and adventurers are going out there and they're coming back saying, man, you ought to see some of these places. There's a land out there that's on fire, smoking and belching fire, and they're saying absolutely incredible stories of a place that, if you've ever been out there, is an absolutely incredible place. And I can understand how they could come back and people would not believe that. So to find out about it, in 1871, they sent the Hayden Expedition out into the Yellowstone country for a couple of months. They went all through it. Two advantages they had was they had William Henry Jackson, who was a Civil War photographer on the trip. That's an 1891 photograph of Old Faithful. That's just, to me, amazing. And they had Thomas Moran, the painter, who painted the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone here. So they brought this stuff back. People went, oh my goodness, it's real. And in 1872, President Ulysses S. Grant signed the first National Park Act, the world's first National Park Act. First time that anybody, especially for 2 million acres, had set aside something that wasn't for wealthy people or nobility, but for everybody. Brand new concept. Well, starting right off day one, there was opposition. People said, no way, this is crazy. This will be the end of Bozeman, Montana. Anybody ever been to Bozeman? It is dang sure still there. They said the same thing about Jackson Hole. Jackson Hole will become a ghost town when you establish Grand Teton National Park. Ever been to the ghost town of Jackson? Hard to get through it. Nobody will ever get there. How many have been to Yellowstone? So have a bunch of other people, right? They tried every way they could to unfund it. And in fact, we had to send the military in there for about 35 or 40 years to run Yellowstone because there were no funding provided for a National Park Service. If you know Yellowstone, this is Mammoth Hot Springs, Fort Yellowstone. All the stone buildings up there were part of the military establishment there. These guys dealt with poachers and timber thieves and trespassers of all kinds and kept the peace until the Park Service was established. In 1901, a tragic thing happened in the assassination of William McKinley. I mean, anytime you have a president killed in office, that's a terrible thing, but it changed the course of conservation in the United States. Absolutely changed. Who was his vice president? That fellow right there. And I spend a little time on Roosevelt because if this had not happened and Roosevelt hadn't come in there, what we know of the public lands today would be a totally different thing. This was one of many sayings that Teddy had. This is one of the reasons he did some of the things he did. This was how we harvested timber in those days. This logging crew would come in here. They would do that. They would pick up camp go to the next place and do it all over again. And there was a serious potential of us running out of timber. This is how they left it. The next thing that happened is they brought in hundreds of thousands of sheep, some cattle too, but hundreds of thousands of sheep. And what happened on a clear-cutted area with sheep taking out the grassland, this is Manti, Utah, about the third time it was completely wiped out by floods and mudslides coming off a mountain that is just completely denuded. And people started saying, this has got to stop. This is not tenable. And so the Forest Reserve Act in 1891 was passed, which is, I didn't know anything about this. This is an incredible opportunity. It allowed a president to pull out of the public estate lands to be set aside as a forest reserve. President Harrison signed the bill originally. He set aside 13 million acres as forest reserves. Then came along Grover Cleveland, who set aside 25 million acres. And McKinley, before he was assassinated, set aside 7 million. And then came Teddy. And he set aside 150 million acres of national forest lands. If you add all those numbers up, the total acreage today of the national forest system is about 195 million acres. That's it. That's almost all of it. Forest Service was established under Teddy Roosevelt, and he picked his first chief of the Forest Service. Anybody know? Gifford Pinchot, absolute wingnut. If you want to read a really good book, read The Big Burn. It'll give you a lot of this conservation issue. Those of you, Greg, in fire and all, it's a must read. It describes the evolution of the wildland fire business in the United States and this huge fire that triggered it. But it also tells a story of Pinchot and Roosevelt. Pinchot's dad was a lumber baron. He did a lot of that kind of stuff you see over there. Pinchot assumed he was going to follow in his footsteps. The family was extremely wealthy. And instead, his dad said, nope, you're going to fix what I screwed up. And sent him to school in Germany and France, silviculture school. And he came back, worked with the Yale Forestry School. North Carolina already had a forestry school, I think, early on. Forestry school. And Pinchot became an aggressive chief of the Forest Service. Interesting thing in the book that you'll read is that Pinchot and Roosevelt were both boxers. And they would meet at the White House, go down to the gym, and then they'd go sit down and talk about conservation and putting together these forest reserves, which they did. In fact, I live right below this, LaSalle National Forest. Teddy set aside in 1906. Had he not done that, it would all be private now. You could drive through it maybe as long, and there's parts of the LaSalles that have purple rocks painted on either side. Don't even think about getting off the road, the sign says. Or the San Juan National Forest over in Colorado, or the Coconino in Arizona. These would not be here. Well, a lot of the senators got upset with him. They said, this has got to stop. So in 1907, they put an amendment in the Agricultural Appropriations Act that said in these states, there'll be no more of this. If Teddy didn't sign this, there would be no agricultural appropriation. Well, he had to sign it by March the 7th. So what did he do? He and Pinchot spent the time and put together 21 more forest reserves that, see, Pinchot would go to his Yale Forestry School. His students would take a topographic map and put a hydrological sensible map on, or drawing on the map. That would become a proclamation that Teddy would sign, and that was a new national forest. So he had a staff working on these things. All he had to do was sign it, and I guess go to the basement with Pinchot. And Forest Service mission, 193 million acres. This is the mission. It doesn't say you use it up. It says you manage these lands in a way that makes sense today, but also for the future. The Antiquities Act came along in 1906. Roosevelt signed it, and it's to protect areas of historic or scientific interest. Many of the parks were originally set aside as national monuments, including Grand Canyon, Arches, Tetons, Olympic, Zion, Petrified Forest, and a bunch of others. Had they not happened, often because of local objection, it wouldn't have happened. For example, in the case of Grand Canyon, and this view of Grand Canyon, Teddy stood on the rim of the Grand Canyon and said, there's no way humans can make that view any better than it is right now. If you've been to the Grand Canyon, then you know that's the case. It's an incredible place. Grand Canyon, 3 bills failed. So Teddy now had this opportunity to set it aside as a national monument. This is the kind of public feedback he was getting. This notion of a national park was not popular with some of the locals. This Williams' son, Williams, Arizona, is right there outside Grand Canyon. They were fairly colorful in their language, describing the idiocy of whoever was setting it aside. Roosevelt established it in 1908 as a national monument, or it would be probably a dammed lake that would be also at about 20% full right now because there's no water out there. His legacy: set aside 230 million acres of land, 100 national forests, 51 fish and wildlife refuges, 5 national parks, and 18 national monuments. And when I say, you know, it would be a different ballgame without this guy, pretty clear that's the case. National Park Service was established in 1916 because we had both the Agriculture Department and Defense Department that were managing these places. It wasn't working out well. And again, their mission a little different than BLM and Forest Service in that we use them in a way that will pass them on unimpaired to the future. That includes some of the best of our historic and prehistoric sites, the places that make us who we are as Americans, and in places in many cases unique in the world. There's not another Grand Canyon, there's not another Redwoods, there's not another Yosemite anywhere. We have, in my opinion, we hold them in trust for the world. Well, problems started from day one. Yellowstone, I'll talk about a couple of challenges when you set aside parks. And I had the same fight here, Clayton. The problem with the park systems, park units, is they never have been set aside big enough to do what they need to do. They've never been set aside big enough to be an island in unacceptable or incompatible development or use. And you know, the stuff we worked on in Bastrop to keep adding acreages, you know, at some point in time, there's no more room to add it. And as Ted Hollingsworth and Corky know, finding the money was a challenge. Well, Yellowstone, remember they said, why are you setting it aside? That's 2 million acres you're locking up. Nobody will ever get there. Well, that obviously was all wrong. And it's also a huge economic generator for that whole part of the world. But the problem with Yellowstone, especially if you look at animals like the bison and the elk, this is the greater Yellowstone. And this is indicative of all the parks in a different kind of scale and way, and animals and so forth. This is Yellowstone. This is the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. This is Grand Teton National Park. These are 6 national forests in the yellow here. This is the summer range only for elk and bison. This is an 8,000-foot high plateau that when the winter comes, this is completely buried way deeper than this room in snow and be well below zero. These animals historically bailed down into this country to get down to where they could make a living in the winter. So if that's all they have there and you manage this area in a way, and this is all private, you have completely changed the ability of Yellowstone to truly function as a natural system. And that's why you have them shooting bison that wander outside some of these boundaries. Canyonlands, which is where I ended up as the general superintendent for 4 parks out there before coming here, was initially proposed to be just this piece on the east side of the Green River and the Colorado River. And they subsequently added that. The original discussion was for a 1 million acre park that included basically all of that. Politically, one senator wanted a 33,000 acre park, the other one wanted 1 million, and they just argued it down. It makes no sense on the ground. Pure politics, which makes it, for those of us that manage parks, absolutely crazy to try to do. Lots of days I've stood here at Grandview Point in my uniform when I was a young guy and talking to visitors and say, where do you think the park is out there? And they said, well, heck, that big bowl, and this is a Wingate sandstone cliff. You take one more step and you're a historical object yourself. I mean, you are gone. And it's truly a big erosion bowl. And they say, well, it's the whole thing, except that's what the political boundary is through there, which makes no sense. If you were to put some kind of potash operation or something out here, you change the whole park. And this place is a gold mine that you can mine forever if you don't screw it up, figuratively. Mine it. Bureau of Land Management use is a combination that Truman did in 1946. It combined the General Land Office with the Grazing Service. They manage all the minerals on federal lands and manage all the non-designated public lands. They still have 285,000 million acres of land under their control. And again, in their mission, it says the same thing: manage them in a way that's productive today, but also will keep them in good shape for the future. This is a huge law. This is one that's terribly important. It repealed the Homestead Act of 1862 in 1976, although there really wasn't much homesteading after the Taylor Grazing Act, I guess, of 1936. Very little homesteading, but you could still homestead till 1976 and 1986 in Alaska. That was repealed, and the Congress declares clearly, and that's why this transfer of public lands is so difficult. This is what the law reads today in the Federal Land Policy Management Act. Only Congress can deauthorize or approve transfers of public land, which is a good thing, although there are lots of people, as I'm going to share with you now in winding this down, that are trying every day to figure how to get this out of public ownership to the states. I'll show you why that's no good. This is what you own as a public landowner. All the lands in the light green are forests. The yellowish is BLM lands. The pinkish colors are Indian reservations. The dark green are national parks, and the blue are Defense Department reserves. Kind of interesting, I said the forests were carved out. These forests were cut over private lands here that were flooding and everything else, and willing sellers sold these to the federal government, which established a number of the eastern national forests that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Your public lands, multiple use, timber, oil and gas, minerals, this is multiple use, watershed, recreation, range and grazing, wildlife and fish, hunting. So one of the things people criticize is, well, these lands don't pay for themselves. The agencies can't make that happen. Congress has to approve that kind of thing. Timber, not much timber coming off federal lands now, mostly private lands, but timber is sold on a bid basis. Oil and gas supposedly is indexed somewhat to the customary percentages, which is somewhere between 12.5% and 25% royalty. Minerals, hard rock minerals, the 1872 Mining Act says the federal government can't charge any royalties for copper, gold, silver, all those kind of things. And a lot of our resources are actually owned by foreign companies now, and they pay nothing to the federal government for that. That's an antiquated law, and if you're serious about these lands paying for themselves, Congress should pass something that says the minerals taken off of public lands should come in here. Recreation, another area where we probably ought to be paying something that goes back into these agencies to operate these planes. Range and grazing, I'm going to talk about just for a second. And of course, wildlife and fisheries, the states out there issue a hunting license, and the federal government doesn't get anything from that, for managing that. And then of course, scientific and historic. Those are the multiple use areas, many of them charging very little or nothing. Grazing is a great example of what I'm talking about. Non-irrigated pasture land. We're not talking about irrigated country. If you are going to rent land in any of those states, Western states, from a private individual, non-irrigated pasture, that's what the average would cost you per AUM month. AUM is a cow calf, a cow, 5 sheep, or 5 goats. It would cost you that. If you were going to, if it was on a state section or blocked up state sections, this is what the state charges. Okay? Anybody have any idea what the federal government charges for an AUM? You can't afford not to graze lands that are absolutely marginal. So you graze in lands in the desert, the only thing that ends up completely getting destroyed in many cases is the riparian area, which is where most of the feed would be. So if you're going to get serious about it, you know, I'm not going to argue the philosophy of grazing on public lands, but this should at least be equivalent to what the state charges in those given states. And in the case of Utah, you'd be paying for non-blocked up single section amount. That if it's blocked up country more than 1 square mile, you're paying $10 an AUM. That's a huge jump from $1.35, but that would be fair. I don't know how you argue against that. Outdoor recreation. Well, I tell you, I don't know how much time I spent with off-road people here in Texas trying to find them someplace that we could rent with grant money to or purchase, and it's just horrible. Harsh use, all these kind of things that you can do out on these public lands, it's just hard to find in the states that don't have many public lands to be able to do. I don't have to tell you about hunting. Out there, you buy a hunting and fishing license, and if you have to draw, you either do or don't. That's a different thing. Other than that, off you go. You don't pay anything to be out there. So the opportunities out there, you know, all the problems with private lands. Some go to the middle of the stream. This guy would be trespassing. Some you can stay in your boat and go down. Some, all kinds of variations of that, which is a challenge, much less so out west. This was a comment from one of the senators that argued against Canyonlands. This is not true. We are just overrun with people now, and it's not getting better. When I was a young ranger, back in 1969, I spent the summer of '69 here in Yellowstone. This was one of the places I would go out in my uniform as a young interpreter, and I'd walk this boardwalk looking for somebody to talk to that wanted to listen to me tell them about these thermal features. And now you just try to keep them getting pushed off the boardwalk because they are in a herd and they're just looking and moving. I don't have to tell you, that's, you know where this is? Texas State Parks, public land transfer. Show you what I'm talking about on this drive to transfer public lands. Utah in 2012 passed an act. Now this is a state act. It is not binding on the federal government, but it shows you what their intent is. This act 2012 said, signed by the governor, that the federal government is to transfer to the state of Utah all BLM lands, all non-wilderness forest lands, the Grand Staircase Escalante, and Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, 31 million acres of land. They're supposed to transfer them by 2014, and they would become state ownership, and the state can retain or sell them. And if it goes to the state, what would that look like? I got to thinking about, you know, I don't believe it would make any sense financially for the state to do that. Utah can't fund what it's got now with that. So I started looking at the monies that go in. I used 2018. Federal revenue share from grazing, oil and gas, any other federal revenues coming in off of that was shared with the state of Utah, $74.5 million. Payment in lieu of taxes, which is a formula of the size of the acreage in a county, the population in the county, and oil and gas revenues was another 40 million. So that's 115 million, $140 million or $115 million you'd have to raise before you even broke even. But then comes the BLM's budget for operation and maintenance. No big projects. Operation and maintenance for 1 year in Utah was $125 million, and they are not overstaffed. I can promise you, you probably aren't going to see a person out there on the land. Forest Service, 70 million acres. Glen Canyon, 12 million acres. Here is the real wild card. Those of you in the fire business know that. In 1 year, the BLM costs were $48 million. The Forest Service costs $36.5 million. Just those figures would completely bankrupt Utah. They couldn't fund that at all. That's wildfire costs. Plus, the state of Utah already had 35 million acres, $35 million worth of cost for themselves. So this is completely untenable. And in fact, the total of these figures was $406 million that the state would have to come up with before they could even break even. So they would have to sell them. And probably you and I wouldn't be the ones that would win. If they go away, this Frederick Law Olmsted, I'm sure you know, was a landscape architect. He laid out Central Park in New York. This is what he said about that, which I think is absolutely right on. And if we're not successful in hanging on to them, that's a sign I took in some in-holdings on the White River National Forest in Colorado. That doesn't say y'all come on in, welcome. It says don't even think about it, come in. So one of the reasons I'm on the road talking about this is you need to know these lands are yours. You need to know that there's people that think they shouldn't be. The really good piece of all this, and if you want to know a bunch more information, this is a national study by the League of Women Voters that's a clearinghouse for a whole lot of outstanding information on this kind of thing. The really good thing is this isn't just the environmentalists that are concerned about the potential transfer. Certainly those of us that like to mountain bike and camp and hike and explore that, yeah, we care about this. But think of being a backcountry hunter and no place to go. Think of being a backcountry fisherman and no place to go. Think of being a four-wheel drive enthusiast and having no place to go. Think of being a backcountry horse user and no place to go unless you're going to rent private ground for somebody. And those people all know that if these go away, they are toast. They will not have a place to go. So the unfortunate thing is too many people don't understand that they are the owners of these lands. They don't understand there's people that aren't looking out necessarily for their interest any more than they were during Teddy Roosevelt's day. I understand that, but there's got to be some safeguards in place. And we're the safeguards out there. So with that, I'll end.